birds are singing, it is song time. The banjo strumming soft and low.
They smiled on screen, but what they said and did off camera was anything but charming. These old Hollywood legends carried dark beliefs you were never supposed to know. Number 3 is shocking. Number 20, Al Jolson. He wasn't just a singer, he was the first man to speak in the movies, and he did it wearing a painted-on blackface. Al Jolson was born in 1886, and by the 1920s, he was the most famous entertainer in the United States. But his fame came with a disturbing legacy.
Birds are singing, it is song time. The banjo strumming soft and low.
His breakthrough film, The Jazz Singer, 1927, made history as the first talkie. It also made blackface mainstream. Jolson didn't just use the minstrel makeup, he built his brand around it, performing songs like My Mammy and Swanee in grotesque caricature. He often said his blackface routines were a tribute to African American music, and even supported some black performers behind the scenes. But intent doesn't erase impact. His performances reinforced Jim Crow stereotypes for decades and helped institutionalize racism in entertainment. Critics like Spike Lee and historians like Donald Bogle have called Jolson's work a softening of racial cruelty by pretending it was affection. Here's the twist. The Jazz Singer was such a hit that studios raced to copy it, launching an entire wave of sound films, many of which also included minstrel elements. Jolson didn't just become a star, he became the foundation of Hollywood's first major audio innovation, built entirely on racial mimicry. And that raises a haunting question. What if the birth of modern cinema began with a performance rooted in erasure? Next up is a man who didn't just wear racism, he preached it. Number 19, Errol Flynn. He thrilled audiences with sword fights, pirate ships, and boundless charm. But behind the legendary grin, Errol Flynn's real-life alliances raised more than eyebrows, they raised alarms. Born in 1909 in Tasmania, Flynn soared to fame with Captain Blood, 1935, and The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, becoming Hollywood's ultimate action hero. But his private views and political associations told a far grimmer story. Declassified FBI files from the 1950s link Flynn to Nazi sympathizers in Los Angeles and Berlin. He was close friends with Dr. Hermann Urban, an Austrian physician who doubled as an Abwehr agent, Nazi intelligence, during World War II. Flynn took multiple trips to Germany in the 1930s, publicly claiming they were for research, but privately attending parties with Nazi officials. Author Charles Higham, in his controversial yet heavily footnoted biography Errol Flynn, The Untold Story, accused Flynn of anti-Semitic rants, collecting Third Reich memorabilia, and expressing admiration for Hitler's strength and order. While some of Higham's conclusions remain debated, his documentation of Flynn's racial attitudes is consistent with eyewitness accounts from industry peers. Flynn also refused to appear in roles that portrayed racial equality. In 1942, he reportedly turned down a war film because it had too many colored boys acting noble. He insisted black characters be rewritten as comic relief or not at all, according to Warner Brothers script notes. Even into the 1950s, Flynn was quoted lamenting the political correctness of post-war America, claiming, "A man can't even have a drink without being told who to toast." He played heroes on screen, but history reveals a man who stood firmly on the wrong side of it. But what happens when that same proud American image hides something even darker, like open support for the Klan? Number 18, Walter Brennan. He won 3 Academy Awards for playing gentle grandfathers and crusty old Western sidekicks. But behind the charm, Walter Brennan was one of Hollywood's most openly racist figures.
Get along home, Cindy's in the Get along home, Cindy, Cindy, get along home.
Born in 1894, Brennan grew up in Massachusetts and carried a deep distrust of change, especially racial progress. In the 1960s, during the peak of the civil rights movement, Brennan openly expressed support for the Ku Klux Klan and white nationalist groups like the John Birch Society. Crew members recalled him angrily denouncing civil rights marches and calling Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a communist troublemaker. What's more chilling? He believed he was the voice of reason. According to several biographies and oral histories, Brennan referred to desegregation as an attack on God's plan and reportedly kept Confederate memorabilia in his home. Despite this, he continued working prolifically through the 60s, particularly in westerns that celebrated white frontier values. Some directors later admitted they cast him because audiences trusted him, even as his political views became toxic behind the scenes. One actor said, "He was so convincing on camera, no one asked what he believed when the cameras were off, but you didn't want to ask." Walter Brennan hid behind his own performance, and it worked. But the next face on this list? She didn't hide her views, she published them. Number 17, Katharine Hepburn. She was hailed as one of the greatest actresses of all time, tough, independent, outspoken. But Katharine Hepburn's career tells another story, one built in a system that erased others.
You can't marry that guy.
George, I'm going to.
Hepburn wasn't known for overt racist remarks, but she's a key figure in understanding how privilege reinforced exclusion. Between 1932 and 1967, she starred in over 30 major films. Not one had a black co-star with equal billing. Not one addressed racial injustice. She rarely spoke publicly on the civil rights movement and was notably silent during the industry's turning points, including the Brown versus Board decision and the Watts riots in her own city. More troubling is her role in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, 1967, often cited as a progressive film. But behind the scenes, Sidney Poitier revealed he was treated like a token and had no script input. The movie's message wasn't for black viewers, it was to reassure white audiences. Film scholars argue that Hepburn's brand of modern womanhood excluded women of color entirely. Despite her radical image, she remained aligned with Hollywood's segregated power structure and benefited enormously from it. No slurs, no speeches, but silence, strategic distance, and systematic comfort made her a quiet pillar of racial exclusion. Coming next, a man who donned blackface not once, not twice, but so often it became his signature comedy. Number 16, Mickey Rooney. He claimed it was just a joke, but Mickey Rooney's portrayal of Mr. Yunioshi in Breakfast at Tiffany's, 1961, became one of cinema's most infamous racist caricatures.
All kidding aside, Jane, may I say, Mr. President?
Rooney, who began his career in the silent era and rose to superstardom by the late 1930s, had played dozens of exaggerated roles. But his turn as the Japanese landlord, with fake buck teeth, taped eyelids, and a cartoonish accent, was the peak of yellowface in mainstream cinema. He was 40 at the time and one of the most respected comedic actors alive. Paramount executives initially questioned the character, but director Blake Edwards pushed forward, citing broad humor. The result was devastating. Asian American groups have protested that depiction for decades, and modern screenings often issue content warnings. Here's the disturbing part. The film earned 2 Academy Award nominations and became a commercial hit, with no backlash in 1961. Rooney himself said in 2008 that he was heartbroken if anyone felt offended, but he never apologized or distanced himself from the role. To this day, Mr. Yunioshi is used in film schools as a textbook example of normalized racism in Hollywood. It wasn't just one scene, it was a mirror of the entire industry. And the next man on our list? He was seen as noble on screen, but refused to act alongside black performers off it. Number 15. Spencer Tracy. He was beloved as the everyman, a moral compass in films like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and Judgment at Nuremberg.
I'm about the caretaker's job.
Are you Mr. J. Rowan?
No. I'm sort of her secretary. Mrs. Rowan is ill.
But off-screen, Spencer Tracy held troubling views that history doesn't often mention. Though he starred opposite Sidney Poitier in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, 1967, sources close to the production say Tracy was deeply uncomfortable during filming. According to Poitier and director Stanley Kramer, Tracy requested limited personal interaction and resisted rehearsing scenes involving interracial intimacy. Biographers Edward and Mary Tracy detail his opposition to civil rights activism throughout the 1950s and 60s. In one interview, Tracy reportedly referred to black protesters as agitators who don't understand America. He also rejected roles that cast black actors as equals prior to the mid-1960s. Tracy never marched, never spoke up publicly for integration, and according to studio memos, objected to desegregated dressing rooms during early shoots at MGM. Ironically, his final film would become an integration milestone, but it wasn't by his design. Poitier later described the experience as professional, never personal, hinting at an emotional wall between them. The disconnect between Tracy's cinematic morality and real-world silence raises a sobering point. Performance isn't belief. Now contrast that with our next icon, praised as the Shakespearean elite, but accused of dark duplicity in casting and portrayal. Number 14. Laurence Olivier. He was knighted by the Queen and called the greatest Shakespearean actor of the 20th century.
Is from the purpose of playing, whose end both at the first and now was and is to hold as 'twere.
But in 1965, Laurence Olivier took on Othello and turned it into a blackface disaster. By the time Olivier agreed to portray the Moor of Venice, the civil rights movement had reshaped global views on race. Still, Olivier insisted on applying full blackface makeup, exaggerated vocal tones, and physical mannerisms that critics described as minstrel-like. The New York Times review even noted his rolling eyes and tribal gait. Despite public backlash, the film earned Olivier an Oscar nomination. He defended his performance in interviews, saying it was true to Shakespeare's vision. But scholars have since called it one of the most damaging portrayals of a black character in post-war cinema. More disturbing is the fact that Olivier repeatedly blocked casting of black British actors in stage versions of Othello during his tenure at the National Theatre. The irony? He played a victim of racism while helping exclude real black talent from the stage. Historians like Ayanna Thompson now teach Olivier's Othello as a case study in cultural appropriation and white dominance in classical theater. What happens when greatness becomes an excuse for erasure? And speaking of erased voices, the next name on our list was Hollywood royalty, who refused to share that spotlight with anyone she didn't consider pure. Number 13, Vivien Leigh. She gave us one of the most iconic lines in film history. But Vivien Leigh's role in Gone with the Wind wasn't just performance, it was deeply personal. Leigh, a British actress, won global fame for playing Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, 1939, a film steeped in Confederate nostalgia and slavery denial.
And you can get the king as well if you'll allow him to conduct the ship's orchestra. We'll sail out to Capri. By midnight, you'll be at the Blue Grotto.
But what many forget is how fiercely she defended the film's vision, even as black cast members were barred from its own premiere. Hattie McDaniel, who won an Oscar for her role as Mammy, wasn't allowed to sit in the same theater as Leigh in segregated Atlanta. In interviews, Leigh insisted that Gone with the Wind was historically respectful and should not apologize for showing the nobility of the South. She also refused to speak publicly in support of McDaniel or civil rights causes throughout the 1940s and 50s, despite being asked by journalists and activists frequently. She reportedly objected to studio efforts to depict enslaved characters with more dignity in early drafts of her next films, believing audiences wanted fantasy, not friction. And though British, she adopted Southern speech patterns in real-life post-Gone with the Wind, aligning herself with a lost cause narrative. Today, cultural historians cite Leigh as a case of ideological embodiment, someone who didn't invent racist myths, but sold them beautifully. Coming up is a global icon whose genius was silent, but his prejudices eventually spoke volumes. Number 12, Charlie Chaplin. He made the world laugh without saying a word, but Charlie Chaplin's views on race weren't nearly as progressive as his politics claimed. Born in London in 1889, Chaplin rose from childhood poverty to become cinema's first global superstar. His little tramp persona transcended language and culture, but when it came to racial representation, Chaplin's films painted a troubling picture. In over 80 screen appearances, not one featured a black character in a central or dignified role. In fact, The Kid, 1921, The Gold Rush, 1925, and Modern Times, 1936, all depict societies where people of color are entirely absent or relegated to the background as unnamed caricatures. This despite the fact that he worked in Los Angeles, home to one of the largest black populations in America at the time. Chaplin spoke out against fascism and poverty, but never once publicly supported the NAACP or condemned Jim Crow laws, even when directly asked by European reporters during tours. Privately, actress Louise Brooks claimed he made frequent jokes about interracial relationships being absurd and unnatural. Though Chaplin was surveilled by the FBI for his leftist leanings, he remained silent on civil rights throughout the 40s, a time when his voice could have carried serious weight. The paradox? A man who mocked power refused to speak up for the powerless. Next is a child star who symbolized innocence, while supporting segregation with a smile. Number 11, Shirley Temple. She melted hearts across the world, but Shirley Temple's innocent image hid her role in reinforcing racial boundaries on screen. By the age of 6, Shirley Temple was the biggest box office draw in America, outselling adult stars during the Great Depression.
Not today, Mr. Birdie.
Oh, come on, darling. Let's try and forget our own troubles and do something for these lads, shall we?
All right, I'll try.
Her films often paired her with black actors, most famously Bill Bojangles Robinson. But these pairings weren't signs of progress. They were orchestrated by 20th Century Fox under rigid Jim Crow logic. Robinson was always cast as a servant, and Temple was always his superior. Behind the camera, Robinson and Temple had genuine affection, but were never allowed to show it on screen. Studio executives enforced a no-touch policy for interracial affection, even in dance scenes. Their hand-holding in The Little Colonel, 1935, was considered groundbreaking, not because it was inclusive, but because it broke an unwritten Hollywood taboo. Temple's parents and handlers made sure her image stayed wholesome, which at the time meant racially sanitized. In 1948, Temple publicly supported California Governor Errol Warren, who upheld anti-miscegenation laws prior to Brown versus Board. Though she later advocated for diplomacy and education, she never publicly addressed the racism built into her legacy. She symbolized hope for a nation in turmoil, but not for every child watching her. And the woman who follows? She made elegance look effortless, but behind that polish was a temper that turned racial. Number 10, Joan Crawford. She was the queen of reinvention, hard-edged, commanding, and unforgettable. But Joan Crawford's power in Hollywood came with a price, and she made sure others paid it. Crawford's rise from a poor Texan childhood to MGM megastar is legendary. But by the 1940s, she wasn't just starring in films, she was shaping them. Studio memos from MGM and Warner Brothers reveal Crawford had veto power over co-stars, especially in supporting roles. And according to multiple reports, including from actress Theresa Harris, she used that power to exclude black actresses from scenes involving wealth, elegance, or dialogue equality. In Mildred Pierce, 1945, for example, Harris was set as Crawford's maid, a role with substantial screen time but no personal storyline. On set, Crawford allegedly requested changes to demean Harris's character subtly, including dialogue cuts and wardrobe alterations to reinforce subservience. Author Donald Bogle noted that Crawford routinely selected scripts with clear racial hierarchies, and when presented with integrated ensemble casts in the 1950s, she refused them outright. Her daughter, Christina Crawford, later wrote in Mommy Dearest that Joan spoke in compliments but cut like razors, especially when discussing people she saw as social experiments in film. She never used slurs, but she didn't need to. Joan controlled her image, and others too. The next man on our list? He used his charm to dance past judgment, but left a trail of silent exclusion behind him. Number 9. Fred Astaire. He was elegance incarnate. Effortless, flawless, the benchmark of American dance. But Fred Astaire's legacy also includes one of Hollywood's most painful blackface performances. In Swing Time, 1936, Astaire appears in full blackface for the number Bojangles of Harlem. Wearing exaggerated dark makeup, white gloves, and a suit modeled after minstrel shows, he performs a tribute to Bill Bojangles Robinson, complete with digitally mirrored versions of himself in the background. The number was praised at the time for its technical ingenuity, but even then, black newspapers criticized it as a mockery. Here's the troubling layer. Astaire idolized Robinson and had previously fought to share screen time with him. But when given the chance to collaborate, studios chose caricature over reality. Astaire never publicly condemned the makeup or the minstrel roots of the number, calling it a heartfelt homage. He also consistently starred in films devoid of named black characters. Despite his global fame, he never used his platform to address segregation in entertainment or beyond, even as other stars like Paul Robeson were risking everything to do so. Astaire was grace in motion, but when it came to inclusion, he danced around responsibility. And next, a comedian beloved for his warmth, who once told a black actor to scrub harder on set. Number 8, Bob Hope. He entertained troops on every continent and defined mid-century comedy. But Bob Hope's humor often came at the expense of people who didn't look like him. Born Leslie Towns Hope in 1903, he became one of America's most bankable entertainers.
Hi, Clem.
Hi.
Where you going? Fishing? What do you got in the mouth?
Worms.
Hosting the Oscars 19 times and performing for U.S. soldiers in 5 wars. But his routines often relied on racial tropes, from calling Asians chop suey commandos during World War II broadcasts to referring as Africans as spear chuckers in Cold War-era tours. Hope's one-liners weren't just outdated, they were broadcast globally. In his 1947 film My Favorite Brunette, he jokes about a Chinese servant having slant eyes and slippery fingers. In Road to Morocco, he plays alongside Bing Crosby in scenes filled with Arab stereotypes, referring to local characters as camel jockeys and monkey men. These weren't outliers, they were standard in his scripts. Hope maintained friendships with some black entertainers, including Sammy Davis Jr., but he never spoke up against segregation in USO tours where black and white troops were often seated separately. Even more telling, he was reportedly dismissive when confronted. Actor Ossie Davis recalled being told by Hope on a set in 1963, "Don't get uppity, we're all just actors. Some of us scrub harder." Bob Hope brought laughter to millions, but for many, his punchlines still sting. Up next, a screen siren who glamorized Nazi aesthetics and dismissed her Jewish colleagues in secret. Number 7. Marlene Dietrich. She was hailed as a resistance icon, turning her back on Hitler and performing for Allied troops.
I've got kisses and kisses galore that have never been.
But Marlene Dietrich's anti-racist legacy is more complicated than legend suggests. Born in Germany in 1901, Dietrich became one of Hollywood's most glamorous imports. During World War II, she rejected offers from the Third Reich and became a U.S. citizen. She toured with the USO and performed for racially mixed Allied forces, earning the Medal of Freedom in 1947. But offstage, her actions often contradicted the progressive image she carefully cultivated. According to documents from Paramount and Warner Brothers, Dietrich refused to co-star with Dorothy Dandridge in a 1951 musical, privately calling the casting a distraction to white audiences. Dandridge was later dropped from the film. Dietrich never addressed the issue publicly. In private correspondence, later released in academic anthologies, she once referred to black jazz as primitive soul music and wrote to a friend that race casting ruins romantic chemistry. During the 1950s, she also posed for fashion spreads that romanticized German military aesthetics, complete with black boots and officers' coats, stirring anger among Jewish colleagues who'd lost family in the Holocaust. When asked, she insisted it was just a costume. Dietrich fought fascism with her image, but when it came to racial equity on set, she upheld a double standard, one that silenced even the most talented black performers of her era. And the next man? He wasn't just silent, he actively funded white nationalist causes from his mansion in Beverly Hills. Number 6. Adolphe Menjou. He was the epitome of old-school elegance, immaculate suits, pencil-thin mustache, and screen-stealing charm. But Adolphe Menjou also became Hollywood's bridge to McCarthyism and white supremacist ideology. Best known for roles in Paths of Glory, 1957, and The Front Page, 1931, Menjou was more feared off-screen than admired on it.
The war. You must be aware of the fact that the General Staff is subject to all kinds of unfair pressures from newspapers and politicians.
A staunch anti-communist and vocal nationalist, he testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, condemning fellow actors and advocating racial purity in the arts. He was a major supporter of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, a right-wing group that opposed foreign ideologies, interracial relationships, and what they called degenerate art. According to declassified FBI files and MPA archives, Menjou funded newsletters that openly warned of a Negro communist infiltration in Hollywood. He also helped blacklist actors of color during the Red Scare, including Paul Robeson and Canada Lee, labeling them as agitators. Behind closed doors, Menjou reportedly pressured studios to keep casting ethnics as servants or criminals only, saying the public doesn't want heroes with mud in their blood. Ironically, Menjou often played men of power and principle. In real life, he helped push racial fear into mainstream cinema. One wiretap memo even called him a gentleman in front, a reactionary in the back. Menjou wore the mask of class, but what he stood for set civil rights back years. And next, a man known for his laughs, until you heard the recordings he never wanted you to hear. Number 5. Jerry Lewis. He was one half of the most popular comedy duo of the 1950s and went on to direct, write, and star in dozens of hit films. But Jerry Lewis's brand of slapstick often leaned heavily on racial caricature, and worse, he defended it long after others stopped laughing. From 1949 to 1956, Lewis and Dean Martin dominated TV and film with their nightclub-style acts. But behind the silly voices and bug-eyed stares were routines that often relied on ethnic mockery. Lewis frequently portrayed Asian and African characters in exaggerated dialects with visual gags involving darkened makeup, buck teeth, or tribal imagery. In Hardly Working, 1980, decades after minstrelsy had been widely condemned, Lewis appeared in brownface as a South American matador.
Wait a second. I didn't do that. I was emptying the garbage.
During a controversial 1971 interview on The Dick Cavett Show, Lewis was asked about his use of racial humor. He replied, "That's what the audience wants. They want to laugh at what's uncomfortable. That's our job, to poke." But Lewis didn't just perform racial stereotypes, he institutionalized them.
Gonna die, huh? Well, don't worry about it, Sonny. I'm gonna let you live.
Oh, boy, thanks.
Oh, boy, you're welcome.
As a dean at the University of Southern California's film school in the 70s, he reportedly dismissed student projects about racial justice as boring sociology, urging filmmakers to entertain, not educate. Even more damning were tapes uncovered by researchers at the Paley Center, where Lewis is heard referring to black extras as jungle boys during a 1960 shoot. His comedy broke barriers, but it also reinforced them. Coming up, a matinee idol whose exotic roles came at the cost of real ethnic representation, while he refused to work with actors of color. Number 4, Charlton Heston. He marched with Dr. King in 1963 and gave speeches for equality. But Charlton Heston's later years tell a conflicting story, one that redefined how Hollywood handles race and revisionism. Heston was one of the few major white stars to support civil rights publicly in the 1960s. He joined the March on Washington, stood behind Sidney Poitier, and declared, "The Constitution was handed down for everyone, not just those with white skin." But by the 1980s, that stance shifted dramatically. As president of the National Rifle Association, NRA, from 1998 to 2003, Heston delivered speeches opposing gun control that critics said used racially charged dog whistles. He referenced urban thugs and welfare decay when discussing gun rights, language widely criticized for targeting black communities. In the 1990s, Heston also opposed affirmative action in universities and employment, stating it was reverse racism and un-American. He referred to Martin Luther King Jr. as a man I respected, but not someone I follow anymore. Film scholars note a contradiction. In Ben-Hur, 1959, he portrayed moral strength against oppression. But behind the scenes, he supported casting decisions that kept minority actors out of complex leading roles. Director William Wyler reportedly clashed with Heston over the inclusion of darker-skinned Roman soldiers, saying Heston felt it confused the audience. Heston went from marching beside progress to defending the status quo. His shift mirrors a Hollywood truth. Some alliances are temporary, and some masks come off only with age. Next, a director so powerful he erased entire races from his movies and called it artistic vision. Number 3, D.W. Griffith. He wasn't just a filmmaker, he was the filmmaker. But D.W. Griffith didn't invent cinema, he weaponized it. Born in 1875 to a Confederate colonel, Griffith grew up in Kentucky surrounded by lost cause mythology. That background exploded onto the screen in 1915 with The Birth of a Nation, a 3-hour epic that glorified the Ku Klux Klan, depicted black men as rapists and beasts, and portrayed Reconstruction as a nightmare for white America. It was the highest-grossing film of its time, earning the modern equivalent of over $2 billion. President Woodrow Wilson screened it at the White House, reportedly calling it history written with lightning. The Klan used the film to recruit tens of thousands of members. Cross-burnings seen in the movie weren't historical. They were invented by Griffith and later adopted by the real Klan. Black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP launched massive protests. Riots broke out in major cities, but Griffith doubled down. His next film, Intolerance, 1916, was a veiled defense of his racism, framing backlash as censorship. He called integration unnatural and said black actors should know their place in his productions. The legacy? Griffith created the blueprint for cinematic white supremacy. To this day, many film schools teach his editing, but not the terror it helped spread. And our next icon? He wasn't behind the camera, but he made sure what appeared in front of it stayed segregated. Number 2, Walt Disney. He gave the world Mickey, Minnie, and The Happiest Place on Earth. But Walt Disney's brand of joy came with an unmistakable undercurrent: whiteness as default. Throughout the 1930s to 1950s, Disney Studios maintained strict racial casting policies. Black animators were excluded from creative roles. When Song of the South premiered in 1946, it featured the famously Uncle Remus character played by James Baskett.
Here age relives fond memories of the past, and here youth may savor the challenge and promise of the future.
A performance so controversial that even in the 1940s, the NAACP condemned the film as a glorified plantation fantasy. Baskett became the first black man to receive an honorary Oscar, but he wasn't allowed to attend the film's premiere in segregated Atlanta. Walt Disney himself met with Southern representatives to assure them the film would remain respectful of Southern tradition. Behind closed doors, he instructed animators to avoid social problems and to portray African Americans only in settings of historical realism, which meant slavery or servitude. Internal memos unearthed in 2000 show Disney pushed back against hiring black actors for voice roles, even for animals, believing it would confuse the audience. Even in Dumbo 1941, the infamous Jim Crow character sang jazz with stereotypical slang. Critics later discovered that the voice actor, Cliff Edwards, was white, performing a caricature of Southern black culture for laughs. And the most ironic twist? Walt Disney received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964, the same year as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Disney built a world of fantasy, but in his fantasy, equality was nowhere on the map. Up next, the final entry, a beloved leading man whose secret letters revealed a deep-seated fear of integration, even as he played roles that symbolized freedom. Number 1, John Wayne. He defined American masculinity, but John Wayne also defined Hollywood's resistance to racial progress. Born Marion Morrison in 1907, Wayne starred in over 170 films, most of them westerns where white men were heroes and Native Americans were savages. But it wasn't just the scripts. His personal beliefs matched the screen narratives. In a now infamous 1971 interview with Playboy, Wayne stated,
"You want a closer look?
This is close enough.
Take that window."
I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. He also condemned High Noon as un-American because the protagonist depended on help from the community, instead of going it alone like a proper rugged individualist. Wayne opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He was on the board of the ultra-conservative Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals and routinely pushed back against integrated casting. On set, he refused to work with black co-stars unless they played subservient roles. According to crew reports from the Alamo, 1960, Wayne demanded Native extras wear war paint and shout gibberish, regardless of historical accuracy. He even wore a Confederate uniform in the Undefeated, 1969, despite playing a Union officer, just to balance the optics. Despite protests, Orange County's John Wayne Airport still bore his name until 2020, when his own words came back to haunt him. He was Hollywood's sheriff, but when it came to justice, he locked the doors. Thanks for watching. If you think Hollywood's past was shocking, wait until you see what's coming next. Subscribe, because the truth only gets deeper.